agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a professor of political science at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, Cleveland area attorney and defender of freedom, Jay Carson.
Hey, good morning, Mike.
Hey, Jay, how are you doing this morning?
Well, for this week, I agree with Stacey Abrams that high turnout has nothing to do with suppression.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that.
I'm just saying I'm turning out, but I still feel suppressed.
I certainly get that. We've got a lot, I think, for today's show. Obviously, we're going to talk about the tragic mass shooting in Texas, primary elections this last week, President Biden signing an executive order on police accountability on the second anniversary of George Floyd's killing, some bipartisan legislation that hopes to regulate big tech, and the firing of a Princeton classics professor and why that might be a thing important to understand, and maybe even a little bit about our uniquely stupid last decade if we have the time to get to it. Anyway, we're going to try to get to as much of that as we possibly can, and we will get started with that in just 1 minute. Okay, Jay, so we open today's show with the tragic and horrific mass shooting at Ross Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas, where gunmen murdered 21 people, 19 of them children. And this, of course, follows the mass shooting in Buffalo, New York, which happened only 10 days before that. And there's a lot we still don't know at this point. Certainly, it seems like the response was, I think it would be fair to say, wanting in many ways, it seems like at this point. But not looking at the specific instance, but kind of the broader discussion that we have. And Jay, you and I have had this conversation, I would say, far too many times.
I'm actually thinking back. I think our first show that we ever did, which I'm sure no one listened to, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
We did like over the phone sort of. I believe it was a mass shooting.
Yeah, and it wouldn't be surprising because, of course, the United States is the world leader by far in mass shootings, and it's a problem that I think tragically shows no sign of going away. So I thought we'd start with the shooting itself and then kind of branch out from that. Jay, any just initial thoughts on, well, I guess how the shooter obtained his weapons, how things played out, and the schools and law enforcement's response based on what we know at this point? And again, should point out it's still a very evolving situation in terms of that.
Yeah, well, I'm as always a little hesitant to get into these kind of things before we know all the facts. I mean, at this point, it would appear that the shooter purchased the guns legally. It would also appear that there were serious lapses in security and response. And I don't. I mean, I'll tell you, like, this is. I have kids, and this is tough to talk about. And just the idea that someone would be so sick or so evil, and I guess at some point, right? Maybe it's one and the same. That they would kill children. It's hard, and to me, that's almost, again, and the difficulty is evil is a tough policy issue to deal with, right? There's no easy public policy.
Yeah, I'm gonna push back on that right away because I understand I understand the use of that term, but I think that's an incredibly unhelpful term. It tries to sort of explain away something without an explanation.
I'll tell you what, I'm going to agree with your pushback.
Okay. Okay.
Because look, I said sick and or evil, right. And because I'll tell you, I have the same response so often. when there's a problem, and it's well, it's it's because racism, you know what I
Right.
mean? And it's
Okay.
well, how does that help move the ball forward then?
Yeah.
But I think we could look at, one, if we want to have a discussion on availability of guns, I think that's a good discussion to have,
Okay.
right? And I'm not sure where I come out on that discussion. Um, but I think everybody would agree that certain restrictions would be reasonable.
Well, yeah. Let's.
And
Yeah.
then I guess the second part of that to me is also the mental health issue. Is there a public policy thing we can do about that?
Okay. Yeah.
Because I think look, guns have been ubiquitous in America for since the founding. You could certainly argue there are a lot more now than there were then. But the things that we're seeing in terms of mass shootings, especially school shootings, are of more recent vintage. It's the last 30 years or so. And a commonality that we're seeing in all of these, aside from the guns, is also it's disturbed young men. And I think that's we need to look at both sides of the equation there.
Yeah. Absolutely. When President Biden, his remarks on it, he said, in part, when in God's name are we going to do what we all know in our gut needs to be done? And it was a very emotional statement. And I certainly understand the president's frustration, and I share it, right? But I don't really agree that we all know in our gut what needs to be
I don't know. Yeah.
done. But I do think that there's at least a remote possibility that there are certain things that it seems like enough of us might agree on to take some sort of reasonable action. Like I would think probably the first thing that comes to mind for me for this is red flag laws, flag laws, right, which allow authorities to temporarily take guns from people deemed by a judge to be a threat to themselves or others. I think that's, if you're going to start with one policy that I think both may actually address these situations potentially and have some sort of potential bipartisan support, it seems to me that that is probably the key starting point. I wanted to get your take on that to begin with.
Yeah, I would support that sort of thing, provided look you would need to have a proper showing to protect due process rights. But that said, I don't think, as long as there is such a showing, I wouldn't see any constitutional problem with something like that. Now, again, when I say such a showing, I don't think you could you can't just have an anonymous phone call to the police saying, "Hey, I think this guy's nuts." Right? I mean, I think there needs to be some sort of evidence hearing.
And that's how red flag laws work
exactly.
in the, I think it's 19 states that they actually are in.
Well, I mean, I think the specifics of them are going to vary from state to state and law to law, right?
Sure.
So that's what I'm saying. But as long as those protections are built into the statute, I mean, it's the same thing. Look, right now we have laws, I'd imagine, in just about every state that if someone seeks a civil protective order in a domestic case or whatever, anti-stalking order, or other assault, courts are free, even in the interim, right, to order, hey, you got to hand over your guns before there's a full, final hearing. Typically, the way those work is there's a ex parte hearing where the petitioner comes into court and says, look, I've got a big problem. I need a protective order right now. Judge grants the order ex parte, and then you have the more full hearing, and typically it's within 2 weeks after that. So yeah, what I'm saying is those processes already exist in other forms. I don't see any constitutional problem in extending them to other situations where there are the red flags.
Yeah, and it's one thing to have these laws in place. It's another thing for them to actually be the public to understand them, for them to be utilized. For instance, I believe in the case of the Buffalo shooting, there actually was the potential, because there is a red flag law in New York State, that could have at least had the potential to have some sort of effect in that instance. And so it's not just having a law, it's people understanding how the law works and being able to, and being comfortable enough with, engaging in that system. There was there's certainly, you mentioned these disturbed young men. There's a profile, right, that is recognizable by researchers, at least generally speaking.
Not by researchers, I would say by
people in general.
Most anybody, right?
Right. The Secret Service did a thing and found that among school shooters, around 80% had been bullied. 3/4 had some kind of disciplinary history at school. And one of the recommendations they made is creating what they call threat assessment teams, which would include teachers, administrators, and law enforcement to kind of help identify, potential shooters. And just generally, I think just more generally, kids who have real problems, and trying to stage some sort of intervention, not just so they don't go and, kill people, but just so they can actually get the help they need. And I think that's certainly something that we could do on the mental health side of things.
Yeah, no, and I am full agreement on that.
But I should also point out, people who are hoping for federal action.
Well, I'm sorry, Mike, let me just add one more thing.
Yeah.
I'd say I'm in full agreement on that. I think I also want to add the caveat that that's all great on paper, but the problem is in real life, especially dealing with someone who's mentally ill. What's on paper doesn't always translate, and that's because I've seen that so many times. Listen, you get a civil protective order and says, listen, this person can't come within so many feet of you, and he has to give up his weapons and so forth. But that piece of paper isn't going to make a difference to a crazy person.
And not only that, but if you think of real life situations, let's say you have a close friend and you think that he's nearing the edge and you know that he has guns. How comfortable are you going to be if you're not entirely sure? Calling up or in trying to start a process by which somebody may or may not take his guns, and if they don't, do you really want to deal with? So so it's certainly not nothing. And if it's done in a way that maybe involves, like the Secret Service suggested, that school authorities and other kind of outside people who maybe have a little more distance, maybe that's an approach that's worth considering. But as you pointed out, there's the what's on paper, what's in law, and then there's the reality. And
there's inherent limits in how well it can work. Yeah.
Exactly. And I should also point out that what I was going to get to is that if anyone is expecting Congress to pass some sort of a national red flag law, I think that's not going to happen. You're going to be disappointed in that. Back in, I think it was 2021, actually, there was actually a bipartisan effort in the Senate, which was led by Marco Rubio, Republican, Florida, to encourage states to implement red flag laws through a grant program. And that actually never even got out of committee. And so I think probably that the best that we could hope for in terms of legislation at the federal level would be some sort of something like that. But there's not going to be a mandatory federal red flag sort of law. I think I'm pretty sure that that's just not going to happen. And that to me is the bare minimum. So there are not going to be any federal standards imposed on states as a result of that. It's just not going to happen. There aren't 60 votes for anything like that. At least that's my take on the legislative environment. I wanted to get your response to that.
I would say, I think there's been a shift.
Yeah. Jay, I understand.
I'm not saying that you necessarily get a red flag law, but I do think there's something different this time. I would say, and again, my preference obviously would be that if we're going to pass these laws, they ought to be done at the state level.
And that's my point, is that what's going to happen at the federal level is the Republicans are going to say, well, this is a state issue and states should definitely do that sort of thing. And also there's the Second Amendment issue. And between those two things, what's going to happen is a whole lot of furor right now, certainly, understandably so. And then the people involved are just going to kind of wait for it to die down, at which it will. We'll move on to the next thing. And there will be no meaningful legislation passed, certainly not in Texas where this happened, and not anywhere else. I feel sickly confident of that, and sick meaning it makes me feel sick. So yeah, I don't think there's been a shift at all. I think people are upset right now and horrified, just like we were upset or horrified after every other mass shooting. Honestly, I think that somebody could go into a school and kill 200 kids, and none of this would change. Not at all. Not a bit.
Well, I disagree, but
Well,
and again, when I
see.
say I see a shift, I don't expect a big bipartisan gun control or red flag bill coming through, passing out of Congress. But I could see something more narrow, like a Rubio proposal of giving states money to implement something passing.
And I would say, the states in which that is perhaps most needed would be the states in which that would be least likely to happen. So that's why I think it's just, and that's federalism, right? If the people in the state of Texas say, you know what, we're going to accept essentially, and this is how I framed it a lot, we're going to accept essentially more gun violence, more gun deaths as the price we pay for easier access to weapons, and then that's a decision that those folks make. And I for a long time have said that, I at least have a certain amount of, even if I disagree, a certain amount of respect for people who frame it that way. But saying that, well, this is a mental health issue, or this is an evil issue. Well, sure, those are aspects. But as many folks have pointed out, there's mental health issues all around the world. There are two parts of this, right?
Yeah.
There are sick people, there are messed up people, and then there is, there's a reason why we don't give babies power tools, for instance. I mean, there's access of things that can harm ourselves and others. And we have, and I'm sure you don't disagree with this, Jay, right, that in the United States, there is greater access, there is more of a gun culture than anywhere else in the world.
Yeah, I think that's right.
And so, when Mitch McConnell said he encouraged John Cornyn to talk with Senate Democrats and other folks about this, he specifically said, and this is very McConnell-esque, people who are interested in trying to get an outcome that is directly related to the problem, right? Because this is another part of the conversation.
Well, isn't that what you would want?
Well, yeah. Well, yes.
I mean, I guess
of course
from what I would read that as Ms. McConnell saying, listen, if you've got actual solutions, proposals that could be solutions to what's happening, let's hear it. But so often the proposal or the so-called solution you see is just the knee jerk. We want to ban guns.
Well, and that's what I'm saying here is how do we define the problem? When I teach public policy, I always say to kids that the solution you're going to get to is very much dependent on how you define the problem. Now, if we're defining the problem, as I think a lot of folks on the right are, at least in Congress, as mass shootings in schools, that's going to lead to one very specific sort of set of policy suggestions, whereas a lot of us on the left define the problem as much more broadly as gun violence, as this being a specific instance. That's going to lead to a very different set of solutions, because if we define it just as mass school shootings, well, that's incredibly rare. The Associated Press did a tally of mass shootings, school shootings over the last basically 23 years, 169. And if you run the math on that, that's a death rate, if you will, of around 1 in 1.3 million, which is, an incredibly, the likelihood, right, of a child being killed as a result of gun violence in a school is less than the likelihood of that child being killed in a car accident driving to school. And so And even if we look at mass shootings more broadly, they make up a very tiny percentage of all gun deaths, right? I mean, in 2020, 54% of gun deaths were suicides, 43% homicides, and the remaining 3% like accidental, undetermined cause, that sort of thing. And so, I mean, mass shootings are maybe slightly over 1% of the total, maybe around 2.5% of all non-suicide gun deaths. And so that's why I think, what problem are we trying to solve here? And I think on the right, it's not the problem of gun violence, right? It's the problem of mass shootings, or I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right, and I think that's a good way to address policy problems, right? Is that they're most specific.
Well, yes.
I mean, it's sort of because again, the term gun violence to me is just sort of, again, very, very hazy. This is, I think I complained about this a couple of weeks ago. We have our, local police report that, and the mayor always says, well, there was an incident of gun violence at such and such a place, by which they mean someone was held up. Well, is that gun violence? Maybe, maybe not. And my also response is, every time I hear that, though, there is gun violence, I ask if they caught the guns that did it. But look, if you're talking about every heart disease kills a lot of people, cancer kills a lot of people, but the treatment for each is different. Lung cancer kills a lot of people, but that's also different than colon cancer. And I think you need to tailor your public policy solutions to the particular problem you're trying to solve. And that's the reason I think where there's so much distrust on the right when liberals will say, well, look, we'd like to have something, we want to do something about these school shootings. And you say, okay, well, let's talk about hardening the targets in the schools. Let's talk about more mental health in the schools. Let's talk about red flag laws. All those kind of, potentially arming people in the schools. But then the response you get is, well, no, we want whatever mass registration and or confiscation or limitations on guns to solve this bigger gun violence problem.
Right, because of course, if you solve that problem, then all these other downstream problems get solved. So I mean,
but that's like saying, listen, people are getting COVID or not COVID. Let's say again, heart disease. Rather than looking at specific interventions to do that, we should say everybody just needs to have a much better, more healthy lifestyle across the board, which would of course be great, right? That's a good thing to do, but you're going to get more people on board, and you're going to move the ball forward more quickly by addressing the discrete problem.
Yeah, I from a policy and from how we move forward perspective, I agree. Other folks would say, well, look what happened in Australia after the Port Arthur shootings and that sort of thing. Entire countries can change, and they have, but they're not the United States. And the fact of the matter is, with around 400 million guns, with by far the most guns, most per capita guns, and that with that gun culture, asking for that sort of change is maybe that would be great. Like for instance, I would love it if everyone became vegan, but that's not going to happen. And me pushing for that is just going to create more problems and
Indeed.
build more resentment, even if I'm right, which of course I am, but that doesn't really help at a very kind of pragmatic type of level.
But also, I think it's important what you just pointed out, though, the contradiction of, we have so many guns, yet these mass shootings, school shootings, are, I mean, on the one hand, when you look at all causes of death, exceedingly rare.
Yeah.
So that's, I mean, and I think that's sort of the argument is, there are a lot of people who have a lot of guns, but the vast majority of them are law abiding and aren't any threat.
Yeah. Which would suggest that something like a very robust system of red flag laws that weren't just like that actually involved school authorities and other things, that there was a lot of attention paid to that would be something that would be much more targeted to address that specific subgroup of the population.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I certainly agree with that. Another thing that would be presumably directly related to the problem, as McConnell put it, would be banning or consider a ban on the sale of high-capacity magazines, right? I mean, the Uvalde shooter used them. Most mass shooters, I believe, before him used some sort of high-capacity magazine that's typically defined as 10 rounds or more. And a high-capacity magazine ban was part of that 1994 assault weapons ban, and there were more than a few loopholes in that ban. But there's a large body of research that suggests that this was associated with a reduction in mass shooting deaths, and there's more recent research that suggests that particularly it's not so much the type of weapon, but reduction of high-capacity magazines may have been a key component of that. And there are, in fact, right now 10 states that prohibit high-capacity magazines, the states you would expect pretty much. And it seems to me, just from a logical standpoint, that makes sense, because if you have a lower capacity magazine, you have to take more time to reload, and you can't, that gives law enforcement more opportunities, and then other folks So what do you think about that? I mean, that's certainly more restrictive, right? And, a lot of folks on the left would say, well, why you need a 100-round drum, magazine anyway? So what are your thoughts on that?
I don't have any specific issue with magazine reduction stuff.
And see, a lot of people do, though. There's kind of not exactly a meme, I don't know what you call a saying or whatever, a catchphrase, I guess, with some folks on the right saying, hey, the Second Amendment isn't for hunting, right? The idea,
True,
and there are plenty of people on the right who say the reason we need high-capacity magazines is we believe, and you can disagree with us, but we believe that there may come a time in our lifetimes where we need to defend ourselves against the state. And we don't want to have to deal with it. And if we're going to do that, we need ammo, we need a lot of it, and we need to be able to fire rapidly. And so sure, we don't need it for deer hunting, but that's not why we have the Second Amendment. We have it to defend ourselves against the state. And if needed, if the state becomes tyrannical, to rebel, to rise up in armed rebellion against the state. And for that, we're going to need high-capacity magazines. And I wanted to get your reaction to that, because to a lot of folks on the left, I think they don't maybe fully grasp that is very much a mindset among a non-insignificant number of Americans.
Yeah, no, I think, look, from sort of like a constitutional sort of theoretical standpoint, they're exactly right. There is very much this sense of the fact that you're able to keep and bear your own arms is sort of the guarantor of the other liberties. It keeps the government honest, if you will. As a practical matter, it comes back down to, look, anyone, no matter how many rounds you have, if you're going up against the federal government, you're going to be outgunned. So I'm again, I want to say I understand that argument, and I think it's it's not a frivolous argument. But I don't think.
Well, I think
it's realistic, and I'd be interested. I'd be interested in seeing, the kind of the numbers on how many large capacity magazine sales there are and where they are, and how that's changed and so forth.
Well, I mean, we are awash in large capacity magazines. I mean, most magazines these days, I would hazard to guess, are 10 or more rounds. That's not really big for, even handgun magazines, 10 or more rounds is not at all. So, and they're also easy, it's not incredibly difficult to sort of create or modify things and that sort of thing. And so, we're awash in guns, we're awash in high capacity magazines, certainly. And so I guess I think it's a good idea in theory, but in practice, I think that sort of thing would be fairly easy to circumvent for the sort of people who would be interested in circumventing that sort of thing. But
no, and I think that comes back to the, again, this is the age old, almost a meme on the right. If you outlaw guns, the only people who have guns will be outlaws, and you could just insert high capacity magazines right? If you outlaw them, the only people who will have high capacity magazines will be criminals. So,
Well, I think that's kind of that logic.
and look, I know, and I will get the argument that you would say, well, look, that makes it sure your hardened criminal, drug cartel member will still find a way to get these weapons, but it will be more difficult for your disturbed 18-year-old kid to get them.
Exactly. Or, even more, I mean, when we talk about gun violence or gun deaths, I mean, the thing we don't talk about or rarely talk about is that what accounts for the majority of that is that suicide, right? And now there's a libertarian.
I would say I'm not seeing the rational relationship between the high magazine count and the suicide.
Right. That would just be more availability of weapons, obviously. Yeah. So yeah. I want to. So let's move on, maybe to another idea. I guess some people suggest is that very popular. I guess what you'd say the center left is about requiring liability insurance for gun owners. Now, to this point, this hasn't really been. There's one place actually where this has been put into place, San Jose, California. They passed a liability insurance requirement in late January of this year. And the basic idea here is that instead of adding on more government regulations and restrictions, we leave a lot of this to the market. So say if you're an 18-year-old male and you want to buy an AR-15 and 300 rounds and a bunch of high-capacity magazines, well, you're probably going to have to fork out a significant insurance premium and show proof of insurance before that can be sold to you. And so what do you think about that kind of approach, Jay, as opposed to something that relies on specific government restrictions?
I mean, I don't necessarily oppose the insurance piece of it. Again, the efficacy of it, I'm a little unsure of, right? I mean, we have laws that you have to show proof of insurance to get your driver's license renewed. Of course, your insurance can lapse and you can still end up driving uninsured. And I would, I guess it's again sort of the mind-boggling sort of thing of, someone's on their way to a mass shooting and they're going to be stopped by police and say, hey, can you show me your proof of insurance?
Right, but I mean, to extend that argument, you wouldn't say, well, why should we bother to have auto insurance because people can drive uninsured? It's a matter of, again, maybe this gets back to
but again, what you're doing is you're appealing to the people who are by nature law abiding.
Right.
Right. What I'm saying is the insurance requirement is not going to deter the criminal or the person who's insane. Now, there may be a roadblock, right, or a speed bump, if you will, if it's a matter of before you purchase a firearm, you have to show proof of insurance.
And that can be important. That's my point.
I'm not sure.
Right?
I'm not sure how that.
But it can be important
because like you got to show that, it does depend on the type of person you are, the gun you're buying.
But that's what the market would. That's
where you're carrying it.
But that's my point. That's what the market would figure out. I mean, insurance companies know how to assess risk and do that all the time, and can respond a lot more quickly and more efficiently.
But the insurance companies might well say, "Hey, you're uninsurable."
There you go.
Yeah.
And so that gets to another issue, right? There are two potential issues with this because I know a lot of folks like this idea.
Former felon, young teen, spend most of my time online on
good luck.
Racist websites or first-person shooter games. What kind of premium am I looking at?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Right, exactly. And a lot of folks would say, well, that's exactly the outcome that we want. But there are two big concerns.
Yeah. But again, I think then it comes back to, then the person's like, well, darn, I can't get insurance. Guess I won't get a gun.
Well, so some people, clearly that's not going to be the case, but for some people it will be, right?
I'll have to get the gun, that I'm going to use in the shooting illegally.
Sure. Just like in countries where guns are just flat out illegal, people who are determined enough will get guns, right? Yeah. But you're not saying that this won't stop, that this will stop some people.
I could see it being a roadblock or a speed bump or one of an instance that could raise a red flag.
Yeah, exactly. So, okay.
Right?
So, I think we actually agree
this
on
guy
this.
applied for insurance but was turned down.
Well, but I think there are two. Well, there's two,
but there's another issue with that.
at least two problems with this. Number one, there are one of our listeners on Discord raised this. There are inequality concerns, right? Because who's going to be most affected by this? Well, high premiums for this sort of thing is poorer folks who you could argue maybe are most in need of home protection or something like that. But that's a reasonable issue. But an even bigger issue, it seems to me, potential constitutional issues. Can you essentially, can certain people basically be deemed uninsurable when it comes to what the Supreme Court has said is a fundamental right? Because if we have a fundamental constitutional right to bear arms, but the state sets up a system by which you have to meet a requirement through the market that you are not able to meet, well, then aren't you, in fact, being denied this fundamental right, whether it's through the state or through a private insurer? It doesn't seem to me to matter. And that to me is a pretty significant issue, because if I were somebody who were interested in challenging this, I would say the San Jose law or something. I think I would have a pretty strong case, and I wanted to get your take on that.
Well, I think you would, yeah. And I mean, if it's essentially banning, but now I think that the I don't want to say hilarious, but kind of the crazy workaround, right, would be, well, then the government will just provide a subsidy for you to buy your gun insurance so that your rights are not. And again, you're getting into this, again, completely bizarro world, right, where now we're spending money to pay people so they can get guns.
And that gets to, with a lot of these proposals, that gets into that issue, because we regulate all kinds of stuff in this country. But when it comes to regulating fundamental rights, that's a lot more difficult, because then the state has a much higher burden and has to use least restrictive means. And that's really tricky. And that goes to me back to the idea of, well, what does the Second Amendment actually mean? Well, five justices on the Supreme Court in Heller said, well, it means that there's an individual right to bear arms. I disagree with that. I think that those five justices got it wrong, and the four justices in the minority were right that that there is not an individual right. But as long as that decision stands, and I don't see it changing anytime in the near future, that is going to present a significant problem, even if there were the political will to make some of these changes, right?
Yeah. And also, Mike, just to let you know, in preparation for this show, I went back and reread Heller.
Okay.
All 157 pages of it.
There's a lot there, yeah.
There's a lot. But I would encourage everyone, no matter where you are on this issue, to do so. Just because it is really well written and argued. And
you're not saying that just because it's Scalia. Yeah. Well, Scalia is most well known for his scathing dissents, but here's a chance where he got to be actually in the
scathing majority.
Exactly, he pretty much was the king of scathing. But I would argue it was well argued on the other side, particularly. But you might disagree with that.
Yeah. Well,
the point is,
nevertheless, what I'm saying is, I think, Mike, what we always strive for on this show is to hopefully get a little more depth on these kind of issues. So that's, go read it and you'll get some depth.
Yeah, if you are someone
157 pages worth.
If you are someone who thinks that the majority, for instance, completely ignored the first part of the Second Amendment, you're wrong. They have a different understanding and contextual view of that. And so I think you're right. On both sides tend to have simplistic views of the Second Amendment that I think reading both sides of that opinion can really give you a much more nuanced sense of.
And plainly, the Heller decision says, yes, you have an individual right to bear arms, but it is not a free-for-all sort of, you have a right to bear and carry any type of arm in any sort of situation, and there's no place for state regulation.
Yeah, definitely that's not the case in that decision. So, there's another proposal that always comes up after mass shootings, is that Congress should repeal the liability protection it gave to gun manufacturers. This is part of the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act 2005. And some folks would actually say, well, this is, you could say this is a free market sort of principle, right? Government shouldn't be giving special protections to certain favored industries. You're a fan of free market type things and government non-intervention. Yeah. So what do you think about that proposal?
So look, I'm kind of I would not be ideally, cases of liability ought to stand and fall on their own merits, right? If you can prove a gun manufacturer was negligent, that they owed a duty to some specific people, and they failed in that duty and harm resulted, then yes, I think you should be able to sue them.
And let me be clear, under that law, still, if gun makers, if their product is, if the gun is, or any part of the system is defective,
sure,
or if they market,
it goes off by accident,
or if they market it deceptively, or in a way that can be seen to encourage illegal activity, they are not protected under this legislation. Essentially,
right.
It basically, as I understand it, it basically protects them from what have been called, and this may sound like it's trivializing it, but it's not, public nuisance lawsuits, where they are manufacturing, selling a legal item, but they are sued for doing so. And there were all sorts of lawsuits along these lines to try to basically make it so create a legal environment in which it would just be they would have to spend so much money defending themselves that it would drive them out of business, basically.
Right, and that I think is one. It's inconsistent with your general principles of the law, right? And I would even think if you could actually prove it. Well, public nuisance is a little different because the statute can define that pretty broadly. And thereby make something that maybe isn't a nuisance, or maybe something that might just be a political nuisance into a public one. So look, I'm in favor of those kind of protections, right?
Yeah.
As long as there still is. But I don't like the idea of gun manufacturers or any manufacturer, right, being held liable for the intentional act of some other person.
Yeah, I read. Because for a while in the past.
Let me, for example, right? Say you're driving your Honda, and you see a guy crossing the sidewalk or the crosswalk, and you're like, I'm just going to run over that son of a bitch. Plainly, Honda should not be liable for that.
Now, of course,
even though there may be plenty of accidents. Now, if you're driving along and your brakes fail and you run them over, well, yes, then Honda should be liable for that.
Now, some people would point out, and rightly so, that Hondas aren't specifically designed and marketed to harm people, to kill people, as many firearms are. But I would argue that while that is certainly the case, it kind of doesn't address the problem, because as long as the actual manufacture and sale of the product is not illegal, then it seems to me to be perverting justice to sue somebody for legally manufactured. So if you want to change that, I'm saying, well, then the way to do that is to put legal restrictions on the manufacture or sale. So to me, that's a way of, these sort of suits are a way of, I understood the intent behind them, and I can be in favor of the overall goal, but I have a real problem with that method, which is why I come down on saying that, no, I don't think that the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act should be repealed, even though I am in favor of what that might result in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And but I would say I would oppose a blanket liability.
Yeah,
protection.
Definitely.
But no, I mean, look, the guns, what their inherent usage is to shoot stuff and or people.
Yeah.
Right. So even if you say, look, and this is my hunting rifle, and I just use it for deer hunting, you can also say, look, I've got a hammer that I got from Sears, and I just use it for pounding nails, but I also might whack somebody over the head with it. Clearly, you know what I mean? You're still using the hammer for the purpose for which it was intended, which is to whack something. The fact that it's misused, that you're using it on a person instead of a nail, doesn't change the product itself.
Yeah, and then you get into the issue of how these things are advertised. Of course, no one is advertising hammers in sort of a suggestive way of, hey, got some problems with the folks at work, look at our hammer, right? And there is some gun advertising that arguably kind of shades into an area where it encourages violence, and I believe there have actually been some lawsuits about that. Now, that's a different issue, certainly.
But it's also I can't. I think you would look at that. One of the ways guns are marketed, and rightfully so, one of their main uses is self-defense.
Yeah, absolutely.
I certainly there's no one marketing guns to say, here, this is, the perfect gun for your mass shooting.
Well, see, there's where, Jay, I think you
that's
need
where
to
we disagree.
No, that's where it's just no one is saying that specifically. But if you look at some of these gun advertisements, it doesn't come out and say that, but there was certainly when the shit hits the fan, if you wanted that, I mean, these sort of things where is it arguing for defensive or is it arguing for take action? And there's a big gray area that's I would argue appealing to people to engage in acts of violence. And that's certainly difficult to prove, but I think it plays into a mindset.
No, I think there's something out there, right? And look, this is in Mike, I'm not particularly a gun person. I've never owned guns, never, felt the need for one. I'm kind of like Batman, but in more ways than you know. But in terms of in terms of people and companies selling things, fear is always a motivator.
Yeah.
Right. And it can be any number of, listen, you need to take this, heart supplement to prevent getting a heart attack, or you need to buy this gun to prevent, getting shot, getting killed, getting held up for your own self-protection. You need it. And in most cases, the threat is exaggerated.
Well, yeah.
But that's not to say that there aren't people who very much need guns, I think, for their own protection.
Well, I think that
there aren't people who, really could use, whether it's a supplement or a particular drug or something like that. But I'm just saying fear is a motivator in sales. And so is the idea of safety, right? You need this to be safe.
And strength, right? I mean, I mean, there's a. So, yeah, it's weird. You mentioned you're not really a gun person, and I'm sort of on the opposite end of that.
Yeah.
Not on the opposite end of that, certainly. I mean, as a Marine, I handled, a bunch of weapons, and that was I had a lot of, interesting and fun experiences with that. And, if my wife weren't adamantly and vehemently and unalterably opposed to firearms, there's no doubt in my mind that I'd have, a few shotguns, a few rifles, 3 or 4 handguns, all kinds of stuff. But
yes,
I would have a mini arsenal. There's no question in my mind. But as much as I may love guns, I love my wife way more, And so, but yeah, and so we're on opposite sides of that in a way. But yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, that's it. I know. And again, I think we've talked about this before on gun shows and part of gun shows where we talked about gun issues. For people who have not, and I have fired guns. I've done like sporting clay shooting and stuff, which it's a ton of fun.
Yeah,
and it is a rush, and I get that rush, right?
Try using it with a grenade launcher. It's even better,
Well, I'd imagine, yeah. But again, never enough that I felt I needed one or wanted one around home. But yeah, I think that's something that there are a lot of folks in the country that, even when I say I'm not a gun person, again, I'm not. I think there are some folks who are so just inherently anti-gun under any circumstances. It's almost while there's some people who have a gun fetish, right? There's almost an anti-gun fetish too, among other people.
Sure.
And I don't know that that's particularly healthy.
Yeah, fetishes in general.
Just in terms of our national dialogue,
sure.
Right? Just because there's this sense of you can never understand what the other side is talking about or thinking about and what they're concerned about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I agree with that. And that's why I wanted to point that out, because I'm arguing for greater restrictions, not because I hate and fear guns. In fact, I would prefer to have guns in my household, but I don't for various reasons of, like I said, loving my wife more than I love guns, which is probably a healthy thing, I would say.
Yeah.
But yeah. One other thing I wanted to, before I forgot, there's this issue also that's been brought up, and this is more from the right, about what's called hardening schools. The NRA has their meeting going on right now. Yesterday, Donald Trump called for impenetrable security at every school all across our land and said schools should be the single hardest target. This idea of single entrances, right, where then there's a security guard and that sort of thing, or a second idea kind of related to this sometimes, arming teachers, arming administrators. I think we should talk about these two, because these are two of the main. We've talked about a lot of policy ideas from the left. We haven't really talked about any from the right, and those I think are the two main things. So let's start with the hardening schools. What's your take on that?
I think it makes sense, and it makes me sad to say that. It makes me sad in that when I went to school, and I imagine when you went to school, Mike, doors were open. You could come and go, whatever door you wanted. There were not. I suppose there was a school security officer, but I don't believe he was.
I never
armed.
saw him, or her.
He was kind of,
Our security officers were the nuns, and yes, you didn't want to get on the wrong side of the nuns, but.
But no, I mean, with my kids' school, anytime I have to go take them there, there's one entrance you can go in, and you have to get buzzed in, and you go in the one door, and then you have to get buzzed into the second door. When the kids go into school, they do have they don't have metal detectors, but they do have people monitoring them coming in. You have to have ID badges, and that makes me sad that that's the world we live in. But on the other hand, I see the necessity for it.
Well, let's talk about that, because here's where I guess do we want our schools to look like and feel like medium security prisons, right? And that's, well, especially when we talk about, and again, I don't mean for this to sound at all unfeeling or crass, but when we talk about the how uncommon these events are, they're horrific and tragic when they happen, absolutely, right? But then when we think about the not inconsiderable psychic and emotional ramifications of creating a prison-like environment in our schools, and that's a very real thing, right? There have been studies of how the sort of regular active shooter response drills, the emotional ramifications on kids and how they may be trauma-inducing in younger kids. Now, there's some mixed studies on that, but the point being is that we need to consider that as well. And so that's why I understand that, well, let's just have armored schools with bulletproof windows and doors and that sort of thing and one entrance. And aside from the practical concerns of making that possible and the economic concerns, and those are certainly surmountable, there's also what sort of an environment are we creating for learning for our children, and that there are costs involved there.
Yeah, no, and I agree. And I would say that the difference is schools are an exception.
Explain what you mean.
And schools are a place where the society ought to have the highest duty in protecting its children.
Absolutely.
Who can't protect themselves.
And yet it seems to me that we're going about this from the wrong angle, where we have a system where it seems to me like, from best I can tell, and you'd be in a better position to say from personal experience, where bullying and teen anxiety and young kids' mental health issues are just endemic. And it seems to me that the way to address that is through much more, first and foremost, through much more robust systems of mental health intervention and detection and that sort of thing, as opposed to creating fortresses
Yeah.
for
Oh, yeah.
these. Okay.
No, but I'm saying there's no reason you can't or shouldn't do both. Um, I
Fair enough.
our school system, and I do some work on local nonprofits that have um, put in a lot of money into. We have on-site counseling center, more outreach, mental health stuff. The at least in the school system where my kids go, the anti-bullying, the mental health piece is very much in play. Right, there are a lot of resources that I think are devoted to that. We've had situations, red flag type situations, where the school has identified people and acted appropriately and took them out, and perhaps it was an overreaction, but in those cases it's better to have the overreaction than to be dealing with the type of thing that we're looking at now.
So then,
And my other point is look, these, I think we'll get better at doing this in a way where the security it's there and it feels it's secure, but it doesn't feel like a prison.
I think that that's tough to pull off, especially with limited resources, certainly. But I don't think that it's impossible. So then you could argue then that given the fact that most states are fairly strapped, right, and they can't engage in deficit spending, here's an opportunity.
Well, no, I mean we have a lot of states and local governments are awash in COVID funds now.
Yeah, but I guess you could potentially then this would be an opportunity, right, for repurposing for federal legislation that would allow repurposing of unused COVID funds for school security, for instance.
Yeah.
And that would be the sort of congressional action that you could perhaps get behind.
Yeah.
That
Absolutely.
maybe some sort of one part hardening, other part it's sometimes been called softening in the sense of enhanced funding for mental health initiatives and early intervention and that sort of thing.
Yeah. What I would also say the mental health initiatives that we have in our school is it's in partnership with the private sector through the Cleveland Clinic, where they actually have offices set up in the school. Not every place is going to have those kind of resources. But I think that's something else to look at is partnerships with the medical and mental health field.
Yeah.
That's a different intervention than just say Congress throw some more money at this. Now money is part of it, but I think these you have local agencies, local charities, local organizations that can step in and play a part in that.
Sure, but of course, for them to be able to do that, then that diverts their resources, and they need to be compensated for that. So it's.
Well, I mean, to some extent, they are, right. Especially if you're a big, I said private sector, but it's kind of quasi private sector, right? It's a nonprofit hospital system. So
Sure.
That nonprofit piece sort of comes with a inherent duty to give back to society. And I think this would be
I don't know about that, but at least in theory, it certainly should.
Right. Well, I mean, you would say, yeah, you live tax free, and therefore, the reason you do is because you provide some other benefit to society. Here's a benefit that could be helpful. So
right. When thinking about sort of, I guess this other aspect of this that I wanted to talk about, my not perfect world certainly, but better world when it comes to this. Or country, if you will, is one in which I have to apply for a license to purchase a weapon, and that application requires that I first pass a course in weapon safety, weapon proficiency, and then once I have that license, I can buy a weapon, but only after I show the seller, whether it's a gun store, a federal firearms authorized person, or a gun show or a private person, my verified proof of this basic this license, liability insurance. I have a gun license that's good for, I don't know, say 4 years. To renew it, I have to go to a state agency, apply for renewal. That includes a background check. I mean, what I'm describing here, obviously, is essentially the process I have to go through to own and operate a motor vehicle. And that's another kind of argument that's been made on the center left, right, is that why don't we regulate firearms like we regulate motor vehicles? And aside from the constitutional issues we're talking about,
because cars aren't in the Constitution.
But to me, I think as the general template, as general model, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I wanted to get your take on what you think about that. Again, certainly details are important, right? Are critical, can be. But what do you think about that as just the general regulatory template, a general model?
So, the former Ohio concealed carry law, and a lot of states had a law similar to this, was like that, right? That if you wanted to carry a concealed firearm, you would have to go through that licensing process, and you would have to do a background check. There was a class, there was a fee, there was all this stuff. There was a sort of a registration, but there were safety protections so that there was, the state wasn't keeping a database. So and maybe this is just personal feelings because I had worked on that legislation. I thought that was a pretty good system.
Yeah.
Now we're recently moving to a new system where it's open carry, which is more consistent with the pure constitutional idea. So, but I think you can say if you want to own a gun or buy a gun, I have difficulty with the pure licensing just to purchase a gun. If you want to do something more with it, like carry it concealed, I think licensing is an appropriate regime.
So I guess help me understand the distinction, because I would think that it seems to me, at least my viewpoint is, if you are going to own something that is not only capable but intended in many instances to inflict bodily harm, fatal bodily harm, then it seems a reasonable stipulation that that the state ensures in the name of public safety that you have demonstrated that you understand how to utilize that, as opposed to just being able to go to the store and just say, yeah, I'll take one of the AR-15s and give me a Desert Eagle and and that Ruger there while we're at it.
I think the difference is, like we started out the show, you have a constitutional right here that's in play. And I think a licensing system, an across-the-board licensing system that regulates even the mere purchase or ownership of firearms, okay, I think goes too far. And to borrow words from other fundamental rights, would place an undue burden on the person seeking to exercise that right.
So I get it. So you're saying essentially that given that the court has said that this fundamental individual right exists, any sort of a regime that kind of puts the burden on the individual to say, here is why I should exercise this right, kind of fails that least restrictive means test.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think if you say, hey, I'm going to buy a gun that I'm going to keep it at home, for my own protection in my home, or I'm going to buy a hunting rifle that I'm going to take hunting sometimes, but store it in my home. That's a little bit of a different situation than I'm buying a handgun. And I'm going to carry it around with me wherever I go.
Right. Okay.
Out in society, out. I think there is a you can draw a distinction there.
I see what you're saying. Yeah, and I would argue that if we want to focus on the broader problem of gun violence and gun deaths, including suicides, then that sort of overall regulatory approach would be the most effective, but would also run into the most likelihood of constitutional problems, which is why, for me, having any kind of a regulatory regime that kind of addresses the root problem as I see it would require the sort of interpretation of the Second Amendment that those 4 justices in the minority had in the Heller case, and not the 5 justices in the majority. And that's just as a matter of reality, that's not going to happen at any time in the foreseeable future.
So I'm going to throw out another. Well, let's go to the arming people in schools, because that you said that was.
I want to mention that because to me that is the unhardening thing. It's like, well, okay, I can see the case. There are things that can be done, certainly. I think arming teachers and administrators is just an awful idea for a bunch of reasons. Number one, most of them, the vast majority of them, don't want to do that. Secondly, it's a bad idea because given how rare these events are, if you give a whole bunch of weapons to a whole bunch of people in schools, what we know is number one, even well-trained law enforcement officers, they miss more often than they hit in these sort of situations. I think the high point data I looked at was LAPD did a real push for this, and they got their hit rate up to something like 48%. So in other words, still, and that was considered to be like, wow, this is really impressive. Somewhere in the 20s for like the New York police, New York City police. So
is that an argument for having larger magazines?
Yeah, it's an argument for even if people because we're talking about collateral damage here, right?
No, but I'm not completely being facetious here.
Okay. And so number one,
you have to be effective if you're only effective 50% of the time.
It would be if there's no one else in the area, but there are a bunch of other people. So no, it's bad for that idea. It's bad for the reason of there's the possibility of other people, kids getting a hold of those guns. There are all kinds of cases of people, I'll just put my gun down while I go to the bathroom or do this, lost guns. And so, no, I think that this is just a horrifically bad idea. And thankfully, it doesn't seem to be actually happening in a lot of cases, because I think this is the sort of solution that creates a lot more problems than it actually would solve.
So I disagree. For the following reasons. One, I understand that there is, when you're introducing guns into a situation, there is always the potential for harm. But given what we're looking at, right, we're 20 little kids were massacred.
You're missing the point, though. You're missing the point. I mean, this is where. You're missing the point, because here's the problem is you're looking at those 20 kids and so the argument, I guess, is that if these teachers had guns, it would be possible that fewer or none of these kids would have been killed, right? That's
Correct.
The whole point. Now, that's possible. That's a possibility, right? But for that possibility to happen, you would have, because we never know where these mass shootings are going to happen. They're very rare events.
They're happening in schools.
Yes, I know, Jay.
Right. That's what I'm saying. So
they're happening everywhere. But let's just look at school shootings. To sufficiently arm and train adequately enough teachers and administrators to lower the probability of these extraordinarily rare events, 169 in 23 years. The collateral damage for that would guaranteed be far greater in terms of gun violence and gun deaths. And so I understand this reaction to do this, but it is an awful idea that would create far orders of magnitude more harm than it would address the problem. That's just a horrible, horrible idea. I get where it's coming from, but this idea of a good guy with a gun, that is the most garbage idea I've heard I hear a lot of awful ideas, but that is the stupidest, most ill-informed idea that I have a pretty strong view on this. Let me
make the case for it.
Okay, go ahead and try, but go ahead and try.
Others might have less strong feelings than you do. There's something else that goes on in that we have a situation in our country where we have declared schools to be gun-free zones. Therefore, if you are a person who is intent on shooting people who are unarmed, knowing that you are not going to encounter any armed resistance, at least immediately, that makes schools a target. And I think that's the sort of this insane. We put up signs saying, "Hey, you can't carry a gun here." Like that's going to slow down any of the people who are actually coming there to do harm. How many mass shootings do we have at banks?
Okay, now that's a different argument, and actually, I think you and I might find some agreement here.
If you know that there's a potential that when you walk in that school, when you walk in that door that was left ajar after you've been shooting your gun outside for 12 minutes into an elementary school, that maybe the janitor or the principal or someone standing there inside is going to have a gun.
I was with you till you said janitor or principal, because it's not like in banks we're arming the tellers. Who has the weapon in a bank, Jay?
Well, the security guard.
There you go, the security guard. So now if you're arguing as part of hardening to say that we need more very well-trained security guards whose job, full-time job it is, to deal with these situations and train for these situations, then okay, I'm on board with that. But if you think that teachers and administrators and janitors just give them a gun and have at it, that's a shit idea. But now saying more security guards, people who are trained and can do that, okay, I'm listening, and that's reasonable.
Let me continue to make the case. So if you, again, but don't you think there would be some deterrent effect knowing that you could encounter someone with a gun? Now, whether it's a security guard or whether it's a teacher or principal or someone else.
I'm not arguing that, but I'm also saying that we know that if there are more guns, given the fact that these shootings are so incredibly rare, right? Again, 169 in 23 years across the entire United States. So our proposal, the proposal to solve this, not minimize this, right, is to give weapons to countless more school officials,
law-abiding people who have volunteered for this duty and have received training to do so.
Yeah, and what kind of training? Because we know even in cases where their full-time job, is dealing with stressful situations and getting a lot of training, police officers. In these situations, what happens when they get in the shootouts? They miss most of the time.
Okay.
So now, do I want a situation where I...
No, and not to make... Look, I don't want to make light of this point, but to, quote Michael Scott quoting Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take.
Yeah, but the thing is Jay,
I can't imagine that there's...
Yeah, okay, you say that. Go ahead and say that when there's a gunman and then there are a bunch of kids around him. And then make light of that.
Well, no,
and some teacher kills a kid.
I'm saying...
No, but it's not hitting a puck into a goal. This is a situation where there are people all around, where people are going to get hurt and killed.
Right. And Mike, if think of it this way, there is a gunman executing elementary school children, and people were standing around helpless. So look, if you want to say, hey, maybe the teacher will miss, maybe, but that person who is performing executions will not.
Right, I understand.
And that's the issue. And I think when you get into those kind of extreme situations, you have to give some people the benefit of the doubt. And I just can't imagine there's anyone. I mean, first of all, I can't imagine being in this situation and thinking, well, boy, I'm glad I don't have a gun.
Well, Jay, but I agree with you. But I feel like I'm sure you're not doing this intentionally, and maybe I'm just misunderstanding, but I feel like you're ignoring the 99.999, whatever it is, % of the time where this will not be happening, where there will be all of these guns in this environment. Now I'm certain. I'm sorry. Let me finish.
Gun violence kind of thing.
Let me finish.
These guns just shoot people by themselves.
Okay, don't let me finish.
No, finish.
What I am saying is that if the concern, and this maybe gets to where we're defining the situation differently, if the concern, as it is for me, is diminishing gun violence, gun shootings and deaths that can be prevented, and that is my main concern, then I believe that it is essentially incontrovertible that this will do more harm than good. Now, if we look at it in a much narrower sense, like it seems like maybe you are here, in just the problem of the 1% of gun deaths that are school shooting deaths, then okay, I think that's a different argument, and then maybe you're right on that actually. But to me, that's not the problem that I'm necessarily looking at, because that's horrific and awful. But I think about what's going to happen when there are all these guns in schools, in instances where there isn't a mass shooter, and over time, that's going to result in more harm done to more people than otherwise. That's my point. So
No,
maybe
and I understand the point you're making.
Okay.
Maybe this is the most concise way I can make my point, is that what we've seen in at least several of these shootings, and particularly in the last one, is that you can't depend on law enforcement to protect you. Whether that's just because it's a terrible situation and there may be no good options, or maybe in cases of in the other cases where they just absolutely fundamentally failed to do their job, or couldn't show up in time, or made bad decisions. I think it's to me as a and I'll play the parent card here. I would feel safer if my kids were at school, knowing that someone else in that school had a gun. Even though in where I live, again, the cops are like 2 minutes away. That there is that extra level of protection, or if you will, even a last level of defense. And to me, I think the potential risks that you're talking about outweigh the actual harm that we have seen, and that in those kind of crisis situations, you ought to give people the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah, and I see what you're saying, and that's a not unreasonable argument, though. I think that just simply the data in terms of looking at overall death and harm just simply breaks very strongly against your argument. So I feel
and to be clear, I'm not suggesting, hey, everybody bring your gun to school. I'm suggesting there would be people who volunteer, who receive fairly intensive training, that there's specific protocols for how those guns are stored and kept, and who has access to them. All those sorts of things, right? I'm not suggesting some sort of Wild West, teacher just kind of walking in wearing a holster. But I think in terms of those, that having that last defense, I think is something that's important. If law enforcement can't or won't or is whatever unable to get the job done.
Yeah, I would go so far as to agree that in many instances, as part of hardening, that perhaps more fully trained, full-time security folks, that might be useful. But I am just far too skeptical, and I think the data backs me up on that, about the negative effects both between shootings, and there are almost no great shootings. Again, very few in the overall context of these things and the overall harm. So I understand what you're saying. I obviously I very strongly disagree, and I think clearly this is such an incredibly emotional issue. I mean, I'm generally not generally, pretty much always a more emotional guy than you, and I got pretty emotional during this discussion, right? Because that's why I think it can be so difficult politically, right? Because people are, I'm very emotional when I think about these deaths, and especially when kids get into the picture. It's impossible not to get emotional. And then people who, as you point out, and we both point out, have a very emotional attachment for various reasons to firearms, and which is why this is just such an incredibly difficult and contentious issue. And you and I, while I can get emotional, I can kind of take a breath and kind of pull back into that's not always an easy thing to do, especially for people who have been, directly involved with these sort of gun violence incidents. And so it's a very tough a very tough issue. And again, our hearts certainly go out to not just the folks in, Uvalde, but the folks in Buffalo and the millions of folks whose lives have been affected by the tragic consequences of gun violence. Not an easy problem. So, all right. Well, it's time to take a breath, I think. And if you are a Politics Guy supporter, we have a lot more for you today. We have the results. We'll talk about the primary elections that happened this week and what we think about them. President Biden's executive order on police accountability. Some bipartisan regulations introduced to regulate big tech, the firing of that Princeton Classics professor and what it says about wokeness, Me Too, all kinds of stuff involved with that. I don't know how much of that we'll get to, but we will get to as much of it as possible in just a minute. If you're not a Patreon supporter, you can become one. Go to patreon.com/politicsguys. You can also support us through Venmo or at politicsguys or through PayPal. And you can find the support links in the show notes and at politicsguys.com/support. And if you're not in the position to support the show financially, I would be happy to give you access. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get you all set up with that. And whether you're a supporter or not, we would really appreciate if you could spread the word by subscribing, rating the show, and leaving a review on whatever podcast app you might be using, and sharing episodes on social media. Thanks so much.